Matt Jacobs, Director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. It's great to see you all here in the Okora at Pugh Hall, and it's great to have all of you visiting us today online as well. We're delighted to have you here. I want to begin first by acknowledging Dean Hub Brown from the College of Journalism and Communications, who unfortunately cannot be here today with us, so I'm going to be speaking on behalf of him as well as the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. UF Science Journalist in Residence program launched in 2014 and brings leading science writers to the UF campus each academic year. The goal of the program is to allow students, faculty, and community members to deepen their knowledge and understanding of science, technology, environmental, and health journalism by interacting with the top journalists in these specializations. For the last several years, the Bob Graham Center for Public Service has been a proud co-sponsor of the SJIR Public Program, this event. We believe very deeply that strong reporting on these sorts of issues is critical to the functioning of our civil society and see it as a form of public service in its own right. And so we're very delighted to be the physical hosts of this program today. I do want to take this moment to thank our co-sponsors for this program. The program is funded by the Office of the Provost, so we thank the Provost's office very much for this. We are also obviously co-sponsors with the College of Journalism and Communication, also the STEM Translational Communication Center, which helps administer the program, and this is also done in collaboration with the Office of Research and UF Health. So there's a lot of folks who come together to pull this off. The visitor, the journalist in residence, typically comes for a few days at a time, spends time going into classes, meeting with students, meeting with faculty, doing a public program. And so it's really a delight and an honor to have them here for this extended period to be able to engage in this way. I'd also like to thank the team here at the Graham Center and in the College of Journalism and Communications that actually puts this on, the staff. So Jennifer, where'd Jennifer go? Back here, who's been involved, Ben, and obviously the team here in the Graham Center and the team behind the scenes working from the College of Journalism and Communications that brings the broadcast out and all of that. Couldn't happen without all of these people doing it. So thank you all for your work and support. The format of today's program will include an introduction of our guest, and I'll introduce that speaker in just a moment. And then the guest will speak for 30 to 40 minutes. That will be followed by a brief moderated set of questions, and then we'll have an open audience Q&A, and those of you who are viewing online, you can submit your questions through the chat feature in YouTube, and we'll be able to get those and read them out here and answer them as well. We will also have a reception following the event upstairs behind you in the O'Neill Reading Room. The steps go up that way. There's an elevator back here if you need one as well. And again, anyone is welcome to participate in that reception. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Annalisa Paul. Dr. Paul is a plant molecular biologist and professor here at the University of Florida. She serves as director of UF's Interdisciplinary Center for Biotechnology Research and chairs the Australia Space Institute Administrator Council. Dr. Paul's research focuses on plant gene expression in response to space flight environments. There's more I could say, but I can't pronounce it, so I won't. And she has conducted research as part of multiple Apollo missions in Antarctica and the Canadian High Arctic. Dr. Paul currently serves on multiple national committees and research boards and is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and of the American Society for Gravitational and Space Research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I have the pleasure of participating in this event, and step one is to introduce our speaker. So Dr. Nadia Drake's a science journalist, and this is an important role that we have in our society to help communicate this. She's an editor, she's a science communication expert who specializes in covering space exploration and the search for life beyond Earth, and also the amazing complexity of life here on our own planet. She's worked for the top science magazines and newspapers in the US, including, but not limited, to like National Geographic, New York Times, Scientific American, Nature, Science News, and is currently the interim physics editor for Quanta Magazine. Dr. Drake often incorporates field reporting into her articles and her science stories, which included adventures from the poles to the tropics, pulled a few things that she had listed in her CV as her favorites are things like explorations of albino redwoods. You know what that is? It's where redwoods that don't have chlorophyll, and they get their nutrition, essentially, their energy, from interacting with the trees around them through their roots. Good metaphor. She also has worked with jaguars and large arachnids, as you can see, and in the jungles of South America, and has a month on the Arctic Ocean. Her work has been recognized with numerous awards, and her advice is sought by NASA, National Academy of Sciences, and other institutions. She holds a PhD in genetics from Cornell University, epigenetics and genomic imprinting, one of my favorites, and is a graduate certificate in science communication from UC Santa Cruz. Dr. Drake is a voice of science and a voice for us, and this is what connects us all. And it is absolutely my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Nadia Drake.
Wow, thank you for that intro. I feel like I sound pretty cool every time I hear about that. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for welcoming me into your community. I have loved meeting with so many of you over the last couple of days and getting to learn more about the issues that are important to you here on campus, as well as in Gainesville and around here. And I'm really looking forward to the rest of the week as well. So I know that my talk title is centered on the role that journalists play in sharing really cool science, and we're going to talk about that, but I'd also like to dive in a little bit deeper and think about the importance of curiosity-driven research, kind of like a little ode to fundamental science, because I've been fortunate to experience the sciences from the perspective of a practicing scientist as well as now a science journalist, and I hope that you will find both of those perspectives to be valuable. So what I'm going to do is tell you a short story about 2 bugs in Peru, and then switch into a little bit of exposition about the basic sciences and journalism, and then circle back and start telling some more stories about the work that I've done more recently and why I think it's important. And that might end up taking about 45 minutes, but I'll try and get it back down to 40. Okay. So there was a time when the internet, or my little corner of the internet, was absolutely enthralled with bugs and spiders, as was I. And folks would kick off some really raucous discussions just by posting images of bugs doing cool things and saying, WTF is this? And at the time, I was a reporter on Wired's science desk based in San Francisco. And luckily for me, Wired's readers absolutely loved stories about spiders, like really, really loved them. And so it was an easy decision to greenlight a story about a post that we saw from Phil Torres, who's an entomologist, describing a very peculiar spider in the Peruvian Amazon. Phil's post checked all the boxes. Cool spider, cool mystery, cool location, extremely current. This was mid-December 2012. Phil had been working at the Tambopata Research Center, which is here in southeastern Peru near the Bolivian border, and he spent his nights wandering around the trails at night looking for bugs, because this is actually the best time to find them. Their eyes glow green or orange in your headlamp. But one day, Phil was leading a bunch of visitors along a path in a floodplain near the research center, and he saw what appeared to be, at least by some standards, a large-ish spider, something that was, 1 or 2 inches across, hanging from a vine. It did not look like a species that he recognized. And as he approached it, it started to vibrate, kind of a weird sort of staccato flutter that came in bursts. And when he leaned in to see what the spider was, he realized that what appeared to be a spider was actually a collection of web trash, things like discarded insect pieces and plant parts that had been arranged into a spidery shape, and this one even had 8 legs. Now, the spider that's in charge of making this is tiny, and it's right here, perched near this other decoy spider's head. And once Phil saw this, he started looking around and realized that in the same patch of floodplain forest, there were about 24 more of these decoy building spiders. Now, not all of the decoys looked as perfectly spiderly as that first one. Some of them looked more like blobs with little appendages or sad octopods, and I especially really like this one that built itself a date. But Phil realized that all of these spiders were doing more or less the same thing, the same basic shape, and they were exhibiting the same basic behavior, that fluttering. So why a tiny spider would want to make itself look larger and more conspicuous to a predator did not immediately make any sense. And when Phil went to find out what it was that he had observed, he discovered that there was absolutely nothing that was published in the scientific literature that looked anything like this. Nobody had any idea what was going on. And that's why he decided to turn to the internet to see if somebody could tell him what was happening in Peru. And that's where I came in. So I interviewed Phil. I did my own reporting that revealed that, as he had said, there were no published reports of anything like this in the scientific literature, and none of the arachnologists that I spoke with had heard of anything like this as well. And so we published a story in Wired about a week later about the decoy building spider, the spiders that sculpt their fake spiders, and this thing, within a week, was the second most popular science story on the entire website for the entire year. It was just that popular. And it was picked up by all kinds of other outlets that were very interested, it turns out, in spiders doing weird things in Peru. So we decided that we were going to keep in touch with Phil, who at that point suspected that perhaps the spider was in the genus Cyclosa, which is well known for putting decorations and other bits of debris in its web. And at the end of the next year, in 2013, this was also when travel budgets existed, Wired decided to send a photographer and me down to Peru to meet the decoy spider face to face. So we were going to be tagging along with Phil, who was going back down, as well as with Larry Reeves, an entomologist who at that point was actually a graduate student here at the University of Florida in Gainesville, and Gina Hill, who worked in the same entomology lab here at the University of Florida. Now, interestingly, Larry had seen these stories about the decoy spider in Peru, and he realized that he had actually found a spider in the Philippines, half a world away, that was doing basically the exact same thing. And so Phil and Larry were going to go get a better look at the South American decoy. And while we were down there, we were going to investigate another little jungly mystery that had popped up in the summer of 2013. And that's this. How many of you have seen these images before, or something like them? These weird silky towers that are surrounded by these intricately woven silky fences. So these things are actually tiny. They're about the size of my thumbnail. And they have come to be affectionately known as silkhenge, for obvious reasons. And like the decoy spider, they had been spotted near the Tambopata Research Center, this time on an island that was a little bit upstream from the research center, by a graduate student named Troy Alexander, who posted these photos to the internet, as Phil did, and basically said, WTF is this? And as with the decoy spider, nobody had any idea what was going on. There were no published reports of these structures in the literature, and in this case, nobody had a clue what was even responsible for making them, or really even what kingdom of life they belonged to, right? These could have been a fungus for all we knew. They could have been the work of spiders. They could have been the work of moths. And we hoped that we could go find out. So there we are in Peru, looking for charismatic mini-fauna, in the dark, during the rainy season. And it was actually not that hard to find the decoy spiders. They were pretty big, remember, 1 to 2 inches across. But those little silkhenges, every night we'd take a boat to the island. We'd start meandering along the trails and shining flashlights up tree trunks and looking for interesting shadows. Often we would find none, but usually where we found one silkhenge, we found more, because they seemed to occur in clusters. And what we really hoped was to find something that was in the act of making them, so we could at least figure out what was responsible. And when that didn't happen, Phil and Larry collected a few of the silkhenges and brought them back to the research center, and we just kind of waited to see what happened. One day, one of the towers hatched a single goldeny orange little spiderling, this little guy. Because it turns out that at the base of each tower is at least one egg, sometimes 2, no more than 3. and a sac that's full of nutrients that we presumed was for the newly hatched spiderlings, but we really had no idea. We also still have no idea who the spiderling is, because it's actually impossible to figure out what a species is based on a spiderling. And as far as I know, nobody has reared these guys to adulthood or done any of the genetic sequencing work that you need to do to figure out who they are. But we published a story along with this beautiful photo spread revealing that spiders are the culprits behind the silk henges. And like that decoy spider story, it went absolutely bonkers. This thing was so popular, and it was picked up by all kinds of other media outlets. But the really cool thing was that after we published that story, I started hearing from folks who'd actually seen these same little confusing creations all over tropical South America. Not all over, in a couple of places. So on top we have the photo from Peru. Someone emailed me a photo from Ecuador. In the middle is a photo from French Guiana, which is actually on the other side of the continent. And then as I was getting ready for this presentation, I started looking into this again to see if there was any more information about what was going on, and found that in 2020, a traveler in Colombia had found a little silk henge and posted it to the internet as well. So we still don't know who these spiders are and why they have evolved to craft such intricate, complex structures. And as with the decoy spiders, we don't know who they are and why they also have evolved to craft such intricate, complex structures. So why am I telling you these two stories about mysterious spiders in Peru? One reason is that I hope that stories like this will encourage readers to really stop and notice the world around them, to pay attention to the little things, those little curiosities that are just waiting to be seen and understood. And places like the Peruvian Amazon are just absolute treasure troves of unexplained, undiscovered little gems. And since that initial reporting trip to Peru, I've actually been back more than a dozen times on different reporting stories, reporting different kinds of stories. And it's still my favorite place to go, because you never know what you might find. Now, another reason that I like doing these stories is because I think we can help readers to vicariously experience what it must be like to be walking along those trails and to meet something that you just don't understand. To, in a way, get to know these little guys. And, I hope, start to care about what we stand to lose if we continue down this path that we're on. As I'm sure you're all aware, biologists are racing against time to document the natural world and to try and figure out how to protect it. And as David Attenborough says, no one will protect what they don't care about, and no one will care about what they have never experienced. So the third reason, and more broadly, is that seeking to observe and understand these spiders is actually a perfect example of curiosity-driven research, the kind of work that we do in the basic sciences. And by that I mean disciplines like physics, chemistry, mathematics, biology, the sorts of things that we all probably had to spend some time with at some point along our educational journeys, whether we actually wanted to or not. I personally enjoyed the sciences. But the basic sciences are incredibly important. These are the disciplines that help us to make sense of the reality that we inhabit. These are the disciplines that help us to push back that boundary between the known and the unknown, that enrich our understanding of the world that we live in, and that help us to put that world into its cosmic context. And like public service, the basic sciences actually benefit everybody, right? They don't cater to markets, they cater to curiosity. And we ask these and other science questions because we have an abiding desire to actually know something, to learn something new, to make a new discovery. And it might not be immediately apparent why it's important to know that something, but that doesn't really matter, right? Like, we don't ask kids who are exploring their backyards why they want to know about butterfly wings or salamanders or what the stars are or why it's so satisfying to mix a bunch of household detergents together and see what happens, even if it's not generally a good idea to do that. We just want to know things. And even though the basic sciences are curiosity-driven, they do form the intellectual scaffolding that supports things like innovation and engineering and, in an ideal world, policymaking. And they do have some very important practical applications as well. So, for example, Without quantum physics and Einstein's theories of relativity, we would not have accurate GPS. You may not have found your way here today. We would not have vaccines or antibiotics or sterile surgeries, which I think we can all appreciate, without a foundational understanding of microbes. Without knowing the structure of DNA, we would not have today's modern gene editing techniques or an understanding of how to diagnose and treat genetic illnesses. And without probability theory or matrix algebra, we wouldn't have machine learning or AI or this beautiful image that ChatGPT drew me when I asked it to please paint the basic sciences in a pastoral landscape. I think it's pretty. So I went to graduate school because I wanted to learn something new. I wanted to, for at least a moment, know something that nobody else on this planet knew. I wanted to discover something. And I was studying a peculiar pattern of gene expression in mice and trying to figure out how that pattern of expression influenced mouse growth and behavior. It was actually a really fun project, but I quickly realized that actually doing research was not really my thing. So I really loved the knowing. I did not really enjoy the doing. And that's when I went and turned to science journalism, to telling the stories of discovery and of the people who made the discoveries, putting those discoveries in context and telling readers why they were important, why it's okay to be excited about this. And journalism, like the basic sciences, is a public service. It provides essential information. It prioritizes truth over entertainment, although I would argue that there's absolutely nothing wrong with writing entertaining stories, and we should all try to do that. And in a functioning democracy, it gives constituents the information that they need to be informed participants in the democratic process. Now, I'm in from Charlottesville, and it's kind of obligatory to include a quote from Thomas Jefferson, so I picked this one. Wherever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. This is what journalism does. And science journalism is no different, even though it's often put in its own silo. But science journalism does something else that's extra. We help readers understand how we go about this business of knowing, the how we know, what the scientific process is, which according to ChatGPT apparently involves doing lab work while you're half buried underground in a tent next to a droopy, double helical, Dolly-esque bit of DNA. I actually don't understand what is going on in this picture, but this is what ChatGPT produced when I said, please draw me an image of the scientific process. But it's our job as scientists and journalists to follow the data where they lead us, and to let those data sculpt our understanding of nature and of reality. Because science is not a democratic process, right? Nature has the final say. And it doesn't care how popular you are or how much money you have. Or as Max Planck says, an experiment is a question that science poses to nature, and a measurement is the recording of nature's answer. Nature has the final say. So in my career in science journalism, I've somehow fallen into specializing in covering space exploration and astrobiology, which challenges us to understand life's origins here on Earth, as well as its distribution throughout the cosmos. And most people think that's because of my dad, that I specialize in those disciplines because of my dad, Frank Drake, who was a pioneer in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and whose work ended up being foundational to astrobiology. And I'm not going to go into this today, but this string of letters down here is what is now known as the Drake equation, which Dad wrote in 1961, and it calculates how many detectable civilizations exist in the Milky Way galaxy. And if you want to know that number, which is n, you need to know the values of all of these other 7 variables. But this thing actually forms the roadmap that astrobiologists use today when they're thinking about searching for life's origins and life beyond Earth. And each one of those variables is actually a very active area of research. So I'm very proud of my dad. But that's actually not how I ended up specializing in astronomy and astrophysics and all of the other things, and that's actually a really boring story that I'm not going to tell you. But suffice it to say, a lot of what I learned about these fields, I learned on the job. And that was actually, pretty scary, at least at first, when the learning curve was quite steep. So one of the first stories that I ever wrote about astronomy was when I was still a student in the UC Santa Cruz program, and it was for the San Jose Mercury News, which at the time was the 5th largest daily newspaper in the United States. So it was a pretty big stage on which to fail. And the story was about a whole bunch of planets that NASA's Kepler mission had discovered. Kepler launched in 2009 with the specific goal of putting a telescope in space. That's this guy, it looks a little bit like a trash can. Putting a telescope in space for the purpose of detecting exoplanets, or planets that are orbiting stars other than the sun. That is a very fundamental basic science question, right? How many planets are there in the galaxy? Are they common? And how many of them might be like Earth? Now, Kepler looked for those planets by staring at a single patch of star-studded sky right here between the constellations Cygnus and Lyra in the northern sky. There's about 150,000 stars in that patch of sky. And it was looking for these brief blips in starlight that are caused by planets passing between their stars and Earth. And in that animation, that shows you what that looks like. And you can see that from those blips, you can figure out how wide a planet is, so that's its radius. And based on the periodicity of those blips, you can figure out a planet's orbit, how long its year is, and from that, how far away from its star is, how far away from its star it is, and what the temperature is likely to be on its surface, and whether it's in the star's habitable zone, which is where the temperature on the surface is right for water to pool and flow across the surface and stay liquid. So you can figure out a lot of things from these blips. And in February 2011, the Kepler team announced that over 4 months of observations, they had discovered just a little bit north of 1,200 planets in that patch of sky, which was an absolutely unheard of number for that time. It nearly quadrupled the number of known exoplanets that we had discovered since 1995, when the first exoplanet was found orbiting a sun-like star. And over those intervening 15 years, astronomers had gotten pretty good at finding a planet or two at a time. But nothing like this had ever happened, and you can see on that graph on the right just how remarkable that planet dump was. And in the story that we put together, I likened that to the explosion in genomic sequencing that occurred also in 1995 after the first complete bacterial genome was sequenced. As well, some of those 1,200 planets, some 46 of them, were determined to be in their stars' habitable zones. And at the time, Kepler's chief scientist said, if we find that Earth-sized planets are common in the habitable zones of stars, it is very likely that means life is common around these stars, which is a pretty profound statement, right? And this was 2011. So also in 2011, during that same info dump, the Kepler team revealed that they had found a very densely packed 6-planet system in which 5 of those worlds orbited within the equivalent of Mercury's orbit. And on the left, you can see a depiction of what that system might look like at dawn, and then some graphics that are comparing that system with our solar system. It's called Kepler-11. And that was the story. That was the first story I wrote about exoplanets. And what happened on that day was that the Kepler mission kind of lodged itself into my brain. Because up until then, I hadn't really been thinking about how common planets are in the galaxy, how many of them might be like Earth. Those were questions that I just hadn't spent much time on. Fast forward to today, and that's basically what I think about every day. So as the staff astronomy reporter at Science News, and then as a contributing writer at National Geographic, I had the privilege to cover the Kepler mission until it ended in 2018, when NASA turned off the telescope after it ran out of fuel and completed a very successful mission. Now, over its primary mission, which lasted 4 years, Kepler found thousands and thousands of planets. And this is an animation that depicts those systems through the end of 2012. And you can see that in Kepler's patch of sky, it's an absolutely flourishing garden of unearthly delights, studded with worlds and planets that are nothing like what we have in our own solar neighborhood. Nothing at all. Now that's cool, but the really cool part is that it was observations like these and data from other exoplanet surveys that recently led astronomers to make a pretty surprising conclusion, which is that planets are incredibly common. They're so common, in fact, that if you go outside at night and you look up, every star that you see in the sky has, on average, at least one planet in orbit, which is really cool. And more than that, hundreds of millions of those worlds, something like 300 million is the estimate, are probably like Earth, by which I mean rocky worlds in temperate orbits around sun-like stars. So if you go back to this quote, if we find that Earth-sized planets are common in the habitable zones of stars, well, check. So this is an absolutely transformative understanding of our place in the cosmos. Like, I really can't emphasize that enough. It's transformative. And it's actually an understanding that I was able to follow the evolution of as a science journalist. I could follow the science as it progressed toward that conclusion. But the implications of that conclusion are also transformative. In fact, all of those exoplanets are one of the main reasons why astrobiology and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence are actually taken seriously by the science community today. And that's because we know that, in theory, habitable real estate in the cosmos is everywhere. It's all over. And we also know from other observations that the building blocks of life, organic molecules, nucleobases, amino acids, are also everywhere that we look in space, from the Martian surface to asteroids to the interstellar medium. So you take all of that together, and to me, it just means that looking for life beyond Earth makes a lot of sense. But you don't have to just take our word for it, right? The science community has repeatedly said that astrobiology and searching for alien life are endeavors that are worthy of investing considerable intellectual and financial resources in. This is the cover of a report that says as much. It's also actually written into the law at this point, the NASA Authorization Acts of 2017 and 2022, that NASA will search for life's origin, evolution, distribution, and future in the universe, which was then built upon in 2022 to include supporting research for technosignatures, or signs of advanced civilizations. And as an example of one of the stories that I've recently covered in this area, in October of 2024, NASA's Clipper spacecraft launched from Cape Canaveral, from Kennedy Space Center, just down the road. And this is a mission that is sending a spacecraft to the Jupiter system to surveil an icy world, a moon called Europa, that we think has all of the ingredients necessary for life as we know it, not only to exist, but to thrive today. We're not looking for ancient life on Mars in this mission. We're looking for things or signs of a habitable environment that exists today. And I have actually learned from my friends in the space sciences that it's sort of obligatory to include a rocket launch video in any public talk you give. So here is Clipper.
Live at NASA's Kennedy Space Center for NASA's Europa Clipper mission, a nearly 2 billion mile, 5.5-year journey to Jupiter's icy ocean moon.
And liftoff. Liftoff of Falcon Heavy with Europa Clipper, unveiling the mysteries of an enormous ocean lurking beneath the icy crust of Jupiter's moon, Europa.
Side booster separation confirmed.
Fairing is separated, and those will be recovered by SpaceX's own recovery ship, Go Cosmos.
This is a big moment for the program, for NASA, APL, and JPL. Let's watch.
Europa Clipper, separation confirmed.
And
So I really do like launch videos, especially with all the dramatic music. This was a really fun launch to watch in person. I was actually there, and I was there for Hurricane Milton the week before. I'm really excited about the mission, but one of the really nice things about it was that the Clipper team decided to put a tribute to my dad on the spacecraft. And what they did was they inscribed the Drake equation in his handwriting onto a plaque that covers the spacecraft's electronics vault. Now, many of them had actually known Dad as a teacher, but they also wanted to just pay tribute to the work that he did that has been foundational to astrobiology and in a very real way to getting missions like Clipper off the ground. So that was a really fun story to write. But it also brings me to my next point, which is that science journalists, no matter how much we might love a result or the people involved, are not cheerleaders. It is not our job to be cheerleaders for the science. We actually do the hard work of reporting out stories, of looking through the primary literature, of finding the right experts to talk to, of interviewing independent experts, and ultimately of evaluating whether something is as good as claimed. It's our job to put discoveries into context for readers, especially when it turns out that there is a controversy among the science community. That's important for readers to know. And so sometimes the stories that we write are not sunny and positive, but we do the work of debunking false claims or holding scientists to account or countering misinformation and hyperbole, sensationalism, disinformation, all of the things that we're all familiar with. And you often see this a lot in the public health sphere, in the stories that are covering public health, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, when there were a lot of very wrong theories about how to treat COVID. Please do not inject bleach. And we still see it now in the stories that continue to push back against the false narrative that vaccines are harmful and that they cause autism. You know, this is hard work. It's hard work to do. But the space sciences are also very full of sensationalism and hyperbole, especially when it comes to looking for alien life. And we often see headlines like this. And I apologize for the fact that the slide kind of looks like a ransom note. I'm really sorry. But these sorts of headlines are a problem that every space reporter has to deal with, right? And they're a problem for a couple of reasons. One is, at best, they're misleading. Usually they're wrong. And two is that they risk saturating the public's interest in the actual, real, very good, very interesting science that's happening in astrobiology. And often, these kinds of headlines are based on work that is just crap. It's really bogus science, or it's somebody who's trying to grab a headline. But sometimes they're based on science that just isn't that great, or that turns out to be wrong, or that people haven't really thought about how to discuss in a way that's conscientious and that pays attention to the nuances and the uncertainty that accompany pretty much every single science result. And there is no shortage of scientists and government agencies making some pretty high-profile mistakes when it comes to announcing discoveries in astrobiology. And so I'm going to give you two examples. The first, in 1996, how many of you are familiar with this already? A couple. NASA scientists announced that they had found what they thought was likely evidence for fossilized microbes in a meteorite that came from Mars. That meteorite is ALH 84001 on the left, and you can see in the inset an image of what could be a microfossil, evidence of ancient life on Mars. Right? If that's real, that's a really big discovery, right? Big if true. And it was so big that President Clinton actually came out and made a speech about it, talking about the discovery of ancient life on Mars, which he said, of course, needs verification, which is true. But this thing went nuts. It was published in one of the very top science journals. The paper still hasn't been retracted. But we now know that there is no evidence for ancient life in this Mars meteorite. More recently, a team of scientists announced that they had found or detected phosphine gas in the atmosphere of Venus, which is a planet that we think is really quite inhospitable based on any reasonable standard. On rocky worlds like Earth and Venus, phosphine gas only exists in the presence of biology. So, the team said that finding phosphine in the Venusian atmosphere was tantalizing evidence that perhaps something lived there, that there may be a habitable zone in the planet's clouds, even if its surface is a roasted hellhole on which nothing could survive. That was also a very big claim, claiming to find evidence of a biosignature on the planet next door. And now it turns out that even though the team stands by their findings, consensus among the scientific community is that the original observations and the original data processing were so flawed that it's highly unlikely the team even detected phosphine at all. And that even if it's there, we cannot yet rule out some kind of complex chemical process that occurs on Venus from producing it in the absence of life. So I bring these up because I think stories like these are frustrating for everybody involved, for scientists, for journalists, for readers, especially when they're too credulous and they ignore all of the nuances and the uncertainty that goes into these discoveries. And so this is actually a very active area of conversation right now between scientists and journalists. There have been many conferences that have happened, many that are coming up. I'm going to one in 2 weeks, where we're all getting together to think about how to best equip scientists to talk about these discoveries in a way that preserves the excitement, but also very clearly communicates nuance and the fact that the scientific process is a process, right? It's a process that iterates. It builds upon knowledge. And it's a process that by design is self-correcting. And so we're all trying to figure out how to do this as best as we can, because I'm sure there are going to be interesting, surprising, exciting discoveries in the pipeline. And so this is something that I think about every day. And it's something that NASA has actually asked me to advise upon in multiple instances. And I'm going to tell you about one of those very quickly, even though it's only arguably under the umbrella of the space sciences. And that is unidentified anomalous phenomenon, or UAP. The things that are formally known as UFOs, right? UAP are the things that we see in our skies that are by definition unidentified. But in history and in literature, we have come to associate these objects with the alien, with the unknown, the otherworldly. And historians will tell you that UFOs are a lens through which you can look to see how humans process ambiguity and things that we just don't understand. Today, the term UFO has evolved into UAP to include objects that are behaving anomalously in space and underwater, in addition to in our skies. So here I am, telling you over and over and over again that the discovery of life beyond Earth is going to be transformative, that we've already transformed our conceptions of our place in the cosmos. But it's also true that plenty of people already think that we have found evidence of life beyond Earth here on Earth. In 2021, a Pew Research poll found that while 2/3 of US adults think that intelligent life exists on other planets, 51% of them think we have probably already found aliens on Earth, that the UFOs reported by the Pentagon are evidence of extraterrestrial technology. 51%. That's these two boxes here. Now, as I said before, science is not a democratic process, and the language of science is data. And so in 2022, Congress established the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO, which is jointly managed by the Department of Defense and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And AARO's job is to lead the US government's approach to study UAP scientifically, using an evidence-based framework and rigorous observations. To date, the office has collected more than 1,600 reports of UAP dating back to 1996. Of those 1,600 reports, the number of cases in which objects are truly behaving anomalously, which according to the previous director means anything that is not readily explained either by a human or by a sensor, is in the single-digit percentages of that 1,600 cases. Hundreds and hundreds of cases have been explained by investigators. And of those, the objects that are involved are things like drones and birds and planes and satellites and balloons and things that you would typically expect to see in the sky. And of the cases that are not yet explained, they remain unexplained because there are not enough data to make a conclusion. And I'll just say that again. There are not enough data. We don't have what we need to make a conclusion about what an object is. In 2022, NASA appointed me to its UAP independent study team. This is our class photo. And our job was to advise the agency on how it could tackle the question of UAP scientifically, and truly if it even should. And I will say that my thinking on that evolved over the year or so that we put together our report, which is here and it's available online. Regardless of what NASA does, I do think that UAP are actually a perfect example that we can use, we scientists and science journalists can use to educate the public about how the scientific process works. So if we want to understand these objects, what kinds of observations do we need to make? What kinds of systems do we need to build? What kinds of instruments do we need to build? What kinds of data collection processes do we want? How can we harness the power of the scientific method to intentionally and rigorously collect the information that we need to say something about the provenances of objects in our airspace that some would say live at the boundary between the known and the unknown when it comes to life's distribution in the cosmos? And that's something that I still believe. So I'm going to leave you with that, but also mention that today, when I think about UAP, I think about what are we going to know in 100 years or 200 years about things like physics and space travel, how to get around in this universe. You know, the theories of quantum mechanics are only a century old. What are we going to know in another 100 years or another millennia? And when I think about exoplanets, all of those planets out there in the search for life, I really do wonder how transformative that discovery is going to be. I think it's going to be transformative, but I don't know. And that's something that I ask a lot of people is, what would finding life beyond Earth actually do for you? Why are you interested in that? Why do you want to know? What would it change? And when I think about spiders, I think about the research that says that spider cognition is actually reflected in the structures that they build. And what that means about the evolution of intelligence and how intelligence is expressed in non-human organisms. And how can we go about learning more about these worlds that very intelligent organisms inhabit? And so I'm really grateful to be a science journalist now, to be able to ask these questions professionally, to synthesize the information and to tell you all the stories about what we're finding out. So thank you. Thank you for coming. And I guess I'll hang out with you after. It was 41 minutes. I'm going to leave that up. Perfect. Should I put the title back up?
So what we're going to do now is something completely different. We're going to sit for a few minutes. We're going to chat amongst ourselves. We're going to spend a little time answering questions that you have from the audience and also from you folks who are online. And if you're online, you can put your questions into the YouTube spot to ask questions, and then those will be related back to us that we can, that Dr. Drake can answer. So I have the unique privilege of being able to ask the first question. So I had a whole bunch of different things that I was thinking that I could add. First of all, I wanted to say the slide that is no longer up there, which has the spiders in space, one of the comments that Dr. Drake had on one of her websites is, there needs to be spiders in space. What does that mean, and where did my brain go instantly with that? And it trips to this concept of intelligences that are not human. It's really easy to, you say something like that, think of aliens and Star Trek and all this other kind of stuff. But part of your work in educating the people here on Earth about the wonders of our Earth that then can translate into curiosity about what could be beyond our edges that we see is very interesting about what do we expect from an intelligence. And we recognize now that cephalopods are more intelligent than we thought. Spiders do really interesting, cool behavior things. So it's way beyond chimpanzees and dolphins. And so how do you envision opening that door for people to think in a broader sense about the sensitivity to intelligence in something that doesn't look like you?
I mean, that's such a good question, and I think, the history of science and in psychology, there's actually been a lot of controversy about how to even define intelligence. Like, what do we mean when we use that term? And it's something that the Drake equation actually has a term in it that has something to do with intelligence. It's F sub I. It says the fraction, you need to know the fraction of ecosystems in which organisms evolve intelligence. And when I'm giving talks about that, I usually skip over it and say, intelligence, very loaded term, let's just not talk about that because we don't really know what we mean. And it's been interesting to see how thinking about measuring intelligence in non-human species has really changed, because now we do know that creatures like cephalopods are brilliant. I mean, they're more intellectually capable than young humans. Because whales are the same. It's like we're learning that intelligence expresses itself in many different ways. Birds, oh my gosh, the corvids, geez, like crows know your face. They know who you are. Like, this is unbelievable. So I like to think about telling the stories of those animals, introducing people to them, the idea that animals are so much more functionally capable than we could have ever imagined. And it's really just a question of opening our own minds to the idea that we humans are really probably not actually the pinnacle of evolution, if I'm allowed to say that. I don't know if that's a good answer or not.
Well, at least this is a good answer from the perspective of there can be a difference between intelligence and sentience, or however you want to parse it out, but the concept that there are things in our world that also have intelligence. And so if we do eventually see creatures from another world, or we have evidence of life from another world, we have to be open-minded enough to think that, well, they don't have to think the way we do. That's not necessarily intelligence or whatever. And so this is the kind of thing that I think helping people think about the broader picture helps us also connect to each other in a way that, yeah, we don't all think the same way. And we can still appreciate that we solve problems in different ways and such.
Wow, we absolutely do solve problems in different ways. And I think, in looking for life beyond Earth, especially in SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, that's what the acronym stands for, technology is used as a proxy for intelligence. The idea being that if you can find extraterrestrial technologies, that indicates that some kind of intelligent creature made them. Like, that's probably true, right? But the way that SETI scientists have been thinking about those technologies and what to look for has evolved hugely over the last 60 or 65 years. So it used to be that we were looking for evidence of technologies that are used in communication, so things like radio waves, because that's what we knew about here on Earth. That's what we knew that we were using and that could be detectable from outer space. But now SETI scientists are looking for a whole range of things, not just radio waves, not even just electromagnetic waves. I mean, they are looking for things like laser light, but they're also looking for things like energy harvesting megastructures, which leave a thermal fingerprint that you can find in infrared data. And so it's been interesting to watch that evolution of thought as well. It's like, how do we step away from our own baked-in assumptions about what we think we should be looking for, based on ourselves? How do we come up with some more agnostic ideas of what those things could be?
Terrific. All right, we've primed the pump. So what about you folks in the audience?
I'll start with a question. So one of the big issues that we see in public discourse today about science is, of course, questioning science, just like there's a declining trust in many institutions. What role do you see science journalists playing in trying to address that? And in some cases, famous examples coming out of the social sciences, like the repeatability crisis, are fueling some of that, but there's other areas too. So if you would just talk about that a little bit, that'd be great.
Yeah, and I might ask some folks in the audience to weigh in as well. No, okay. So it is true that there is an erosion of trust in science, but also an erosion of trust in journalism. So it's kind of a double whammy for science journalists. And I think in general, one of the reasons that people don't trust scientists is because scientists change their minds, and that's seen as a bad thing. You tend to get this in headlines that, like, even I will make fun of, where you see stories that say one day that drinking red wine is good for you, next day it's bad for you, next day it's good for you, and so you're just kind of flip-flopping between these two things without a lot of knowledge about the context in which those results occurred and the differences in the studies. And so I think, you know, one of the things that science journalists can do, and it's part of the hard work that I mentioned very briefly, is to really educate people about the scientific process and the fact that it's a process, and that changing your mind about something just means that you've gathered more data and more information that are pointing in a different direction than you may have initially anticipated, and that that's okay. That's actually how science is supposed to work when it's working. The trouble is that a lot of the work that science journalists do today, we just don't have the space to make those kinds of explanations, to really dive into, you know, nuance is like my favorite word when it comes to things like this, because everything is nuanced. There's ambiguity and there's uncertainty. And everybody, readers especially, don't want uncertainty, right? We like to know things for sure. And so it's easy to kind of pull back from embracing that uncertainty and from diving into the ambiguity. And so when I'm talking with scientists about how they can communicate their results, I tell them, like, lean into that, you know, be very honest and open about what you don't know, so that if you do come up with more information that says, hey, this thing that I told you, thing A, is now thing B, and it's different, we're not like, oh, oops. It's like, that is science actually working as it's supposed to. I don't know if that's a good answer to your question or not, but that's what I was thinking.
That there are scientists who don't help. They don't help out. The beginning of COVID, I was so excited to see major newspapers featuring curves and graphs and explaining, you know, epidemiology. I was so excited. And very quickly it started to go south because of, you know, the disagreements that are very common in science. And then you have people who deliberately obfuscate. And you probably have read Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's The Merchants of Doubt. All you have to do is present an alternative scenario and to prop up a scientist, quotation marks around that, and all they have to do is say, well, we're not sure about that. Generate the controversy where there may be limited controversy or something that's perfectly reasonable, you know, that we see this in the history of science. And the average person is just going to say, we don't know, and nothing happens, right? You saw this in COVID. I mean, there were scientists out there. One of them is running the National Institute of Health right now, Jay Bhattacharya. We know him here in Florida because he was brought in to advise, you know, the governor. And the university was opened up because of him. So question one, how do we deal with that? And then the second, more delightful question, I want to know more about what happened to you between your conversion of from being a geneticist to being a science writer. I think it's really important to share that, especially with younger people. I went through that, and I converted to historian. But I want to hear more about that.
Well, I guess I'll take the second question. I mean, the first question is a good one. It's a hard one. So we'll go with the second. just because anyway. It really was kind of as simple as being disillusioned with doing the lab work. I was really interested in the questions I was asking and in the projects that I was working on, but I did not like the day-to-day. I did not like coming in and working with mouse brains and troubleshooting the experiments over and over and over and over again. And anyone who works in molecular biology knows that troubleshooting is pretty much what you do all the time. if you want your PCR to give you a result that's reliable, you're going to spend a lot of time turning those knobs. And that just was not what my brain was interested in. And I was also not the kind of person who could just focus on one specific thing. And so finding a profession like science writing that let me stay adjacent to the science, but, dip my toes into different pools every day seemed like a very good next step. And then going to the UC Santa Cruz Science Communication program for me was absolutely essential because I was totally clueless when it came to actually doing science writing and science journalism and how it all worked. But yeah, for me, that was pretty much the perfect fit. So yeah, that's more optimistic. Let's end there.
No, so that's perfect. Before I make a comment on that, I want to make sure that, first of all, do we have any other folks in the room that want to get a question out? And do we have any ones from online? And I confess, I don't know how to figure that one out, but someone will tell me. Okay, perfect. All right.
Thank you for your talk. It was excellent. Excuse me, very thought-provoking. So we seem, this goes to science journalism. So we seem to be in this moment when there's a great deal of interest in personality-driven journalism or personality-driven information by podcasters, by influencers. So I don't remember what, but I remember the number of people that listen to Joe Rogan is something exponentially higher than the number of people who read the New York Times. And so I'm just curious if science journalists are able, or if you all think about how to capture that obvious force in our culture to further what we would consider good journalism or good science journalism. Like, is there any movement or am I missing developments in that area? Because there's an obvious public demand for this. And it doesn't seem to me that it's exclusively, that it can't be, that it has to be unscientific, that it could be tapped. So I was just curious what you see in sort of personality-driven science journalism.
Yeah, I think one of the fundamental conflicts between influencers and journalists is that as journalists, we're not supposed to be doing the influencing, right? We're supposed to be providing the objective take on what's going on. And, the caveat there is that nothing is ever truly objective, right? Everybody's being very subjective in choice of story and choice of source and choice of information that they include, the quotes, like all of it is pretty subjective. But, the institution of journalism is not the same. And so I think that's one of the fundamental conflicts that you run into when you think about things like that. It is true that there is an appetite for that sort of personality. And I think what we are seeing on a positive note is that a lot of science communicators are building that same kind of following. It's smaller, but there is an effort to make a platform for yourself as a science communicator that builds an audience and that does focus on science communication. It may not be, journalism as we think about it, but that may not matter, right? As long as we're getting the science across and we're doing it in a way that's accurate, I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. But I'm curious if anyone in the audience knows of things that I am unaware of here that might be a better answer to that question.
I want to piggyback on that, on Aaron's question, and ask about the role of scientists in sharing their discoveries beyond their small circle, beyond their journal or their field. Do you feel like that has changed over time? Like a lot of younger scientists today grew up, they're digital natives, they grew up with MySpace and Facebook. Do you see any kind of positive in the future from that?
Yeah, totally. I think there's been a really big move toward prioritizing good communication among scientists that is happening now. And really, I would say over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years is when I've really started to notice it. Like it used to be that I would get invitations to speak at conferences of graduate students that were aimed toward alternative careers, right? Careers that are not in academia. And what used to happen in some of those conferences was that graduate students would go and they would say, please do not tell my advisor that I'm here. They cannot know that I'm here. Like I am here, I told them I'm like sick, I'm out of town. But they would go to this conference and try and learn about doing something that actually fit them better. And I don't think that that's the case anymore. Even the terminology has changed, right? It's not alternative, it's just non-academic. And the reality is that most careers are non-academic. So I think there really has been a move to prioritize good communication skills. Certainly, I sit on an awards committee that gives out a lot of money to scientists that do a very good job communicating about what they do. And that's the Schmidt Sciences Awards, SciComm Awards. And we give those to graduate students and early career researchers and senior scientists. And I think it's been really great to watch as this kind of movement has sprung up, because there's nothing bad. Like there's nothing bad about talking about your own science, right? Like we journalists tend to have bigger platforms, at least we did when the publications that we worked for were in better shape. But I absolutely love that scientists are prioritizing this sort of thing. I think it's just so important. I mean, look where I ended up. So clearly I'm biased there.
We do have a question from online. So one of our viewers writes in to ask about alternative forms of science communication. So asking you for your thoughts on things like science fiction and fantasy writing as a form of science communication as well. So if you have any thoughts on that.
I haven't really thought about that. I am definitely a fan of sci-fi or future fiction or speculative fiction or whatever you want to call it. I think that plays a very important role in inspiring people to ask big questions about what could be possible in the future and in thinking about that. I can certainly see that there are examples that would live very comfortably in the middle of the Venn diagram between sci-fi and science communication. Thinking here about like Kim Stanley Robinson's work, Andy Weir's work, like there's a lot of books that really prioritize getting the science right while creating a compelling narrative. And one of the things that we as journalists know is that compelling narratives are very good vehicles to use for sharing information, right? We've told stories for millennia because the structure works. There are ways that we get to remember information, and so I think that's great. I think if you can do that using a different format, why not?
It also raises an interesting question. So I'm a historian, and so if you think about historical fiction, where's the point where we think getting the history absolutely right matters versus where are you willing to take some, shall we say, creative license to convey a larger point that you think is more important than the specific details? And so that would be another thing to think about in the science communication space too. Where would we want that line to be? Not that there's a single definition of that line. But.
Right, and there's some really interesting thought about the relationship of storytelling to truth and what kind of truth you're actually trying to find through storytelling. And here I'm thinking about like Tim O'Brien's works. He writes a lot about the Vietnam War, but he has some really interesting ideas about how, a story that you're telling, it might contain your truth, but there is no such thing as the absolute truth. And so storytelling really is a way of finding some kind of emotional truth that resonates and of making sense of things that happened. Kind of like what I said about the basic sciences, making sense of reality. It's all a quest to make meaning out of what we experience and what we see. The sciences do that, storytelling does that, art does that too, to an extreme degree. There's a really big amount of overlap there.
I think that is about wraps up the time that we have. Were there any last questions in the room that anyone wanted to ask? Okay, excellent.
No, but your dad used science fiction in his class. Did you know that? I did. The Black Cloud. He had us read that book.
All right. So I think I'd like to wrap us up here just a little bit with a couple of words, a couple of thoughts. And that is, this concept of storytelling is what helps connect us humans. Whether you are trying to connect and have somebody see something from a different perspective, or give a truth that is pure science, unless you can connect with another person, they're not going to read it. If, my papers on molecular genetics are not so popular with, just your average person. However, if you cast it in a story that allows you to connect with people to say, this is why this is important to me, and sometimes you can say, this is why it should be connected to you. When you love something and you share it, it helps bring us all together. And so when you were saying earlier about, yeah, man, I didn't like working in the lab so much, thank goodness, because it takes everybody. Everybody has a different thing that they love, and a different way that they put their spin on the world and the story, and helping all of us carry that message. It's what makes us all better. So thank you for that. Thank you. And thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. One more thing, one more duty. I have to say that after we're going to hang out here for a couple minutes, and then everyone can join upstairs for a reception. Yeah. Anything else?